Hi, welcome back to Metapunk Zero. I'm Andre, and in this episode of the Psychosis Diaries, I'm going to be talking about the idea of shamanic initiation. Hi, for a long time, as I've been talking about psychosis on this channel, I've been incorporating the idea of spiritual awakening in that because a psychosis, maybe not all psychoses. I mean, I don't want to talk about. I don't want to try to define other people's experiences of psychosis. I just know for me that psychotic experience or psychosis experience and mystical experience are very much the same thing. Or not, maybe not exactly the same thing. I believe Joseph Campbell really hit the nail on the head when he said that the psychotic is drowning in the waters in which the mystic swims with the light, and that really nails it because you're dealing with this archetypal world. You're dealing with this very mythic layer of consciousness or reality. Because at a certain level, consciousness and reality become inseparable. This is in tune with the alchemical principle that the universe is mental, which is really interesting because we have this long esoteric tradition that talks about how the universe is mental. That very much falls in line with some theological stuff, but after sort of the advent of mainstream like Christianity, like the Council of Nicaea, and they sort of formalized the Christian doctrine and formed the Roman Catholic Church. It paves the way for the scientific revolution, which fundamentally posits God and meaning as something separate from oneself. The narrative of the universe is separate from the individual, and that also we get with that materialism. We get the dominance of the materialistic scientific culture, which we're very much, is very much running rampant these days. It's in our economics, it's certainly in our science, it's in our politics, it's in our relationships. The way that we objectify each other and feel objectified is very much a materialistic sort of way of viewing the universe. Martin Buber, existentialist philosopher, and also, I believe, a Hasidic Jewish practitioner, so like a mystical Jewish person, talked about I and thou and I and it relationships. And he wrote a book called I and Thou, which talks about that, how you can relate to the world as if you're actually relating to the world as a person, kind of, or you can relate to it as an object, and I think that really speaks to kind of what I'm getting at here, and that is this idea that consciousness and mythic reality and physical reality at the same time are kind of connected, and the universe is mental, and this is certainly something that occurs when you're in a psychosis experience. This is something that comes up, this visceral sense of it, and I think that does overlap, creates an overlap between psychotic experience and mystical experience, spiritual experience, because you're dealing with this layer of reality, and you're dealing with things on a symbolic level, and you start to realize the symbolic nature of everything. I often think about this in terms of fiction. In Lord of the Rings, there's a device called a palantir, which I'm not sure where Tolkien got the name for that. He was an expert of words and names, of course, but whatever it was a scrying sphere. It was a crystal ball that you could use, and you could look into it, and you could see, probably the past and the future and places far away. You could kind of do remote viewing through the palantir, but you could also use it as a communication device. You could send information, you could send messages through it, and of course the people that had the palantirs, because Sauron, the Dark Lord, had a palantir in his tower, and Saruman the White had a palantir, and I believe they had a palantir in Gondor. And it's interesting because everybody who had a palantir was corrupted by Sauron. So Saruman and I can't remember his name, the steward of Gondor, who kind of dies horribly and whatever, and he kind of refuses to relinquish. He's kind of been corrupted. And I remember when I called the television a palantir, because a television kind of is a palantir in a sense. It's very similar. and you can get good ideas through it, but you can also get a lot of bad ideas through it, and so it can kind of warp your mind a little bit. And does it matter whether we call that a Palantir? Is it a magical device, or is it a television? Is it a scientific device? Does it really matter? I mean, on a scientific level it matters. On a technical level, there's physics that go into making a television, whereas I don't know what magic could be or would be, but in some sense it's a metaphor as far as the rest of us are concerned. It's just a device that does this thing of communication, and so I'm communicating to you via a camera and an internet and all these sorts of things, but I could just as easily be broadcasting a telepathic message to you, in some sense, in a different world I would be, and maybe there is no difference. I don't know. Maybe our sense of physical reality is just an interface for some deeper conceptual layer, and that's kind of what I mean. And that's where in Psychosis you kind of get at this. And we can interpret that scientifically now. But archaic cultures didn't have our materialistic science. They didn't look at the world as a materialistic ontology. They didn't look at it as a set of objects. They looked at the world as relationships, because that's all they had. They related to things personally. And you can also see psychologically this actually makes a lot of sense. They related to the universe as an I thou rather than I it. We relate as I it. We see dead objects and we interact with them. But archaic cultures saw everything as kind of alive. This is the meaning of animism, right? Everything is alive. Everything is imbued with spirit. Everything in some sense maybe has its own personality depending on how deep into it you go. Everything is God on some level as well. It's sort of pantheistic on that, in that way as well. But it's this idea that you relate to things, and your relationship with things determines how you interact with them, and how they respond to you, and how you fare in the world. And so I think it's really interesting, because historically, when somebody became a shaman in an archaic culture, and not even archaic, there's cultures today that still practice animistic ways of relating to the world, and animistic religions and spiritualities and so forth. And the way that somebody would become a shaman is usually through some sort of initiation, and sometimes, kind of rarely, that would be the elder shaman in the group, in the tribe, in the community would be would find somebody that showed some promise or whatever, and then would start teaching them. But more often than not, what happened was somebody would actually experience a great illness or tragedy. They would go through what's called a shamanic awakening crisis, and that was quite often a mental health crisis of some sort, or that's what we would call it today. So often psychosis it overlaps with what would have historically been called a shamanic awakening, and it's because you are tapping into this deeper layer, this layer at which spirit and matter are kind of one thing, and where reality and thought are kind of one thing, where consciousness and the universe are coextensive. And so I think it's important to remember that, because I think the fact that your prognosis for recovery from psychosis is much better in the developing world than it is in the developed world. And there's a bunch of reasons why this might be, and part of it is probably a better sense of community, tighter knit community, more acceptance in those communities, more of a sense in which people are just sort of accepted for who they are and how they're showing up, rather than trying to fit them into a mold of conformity of like what they should be and what they should be able to do, and trying to achieve goals and having a goal-directed outlook and all those sorts of things that we associate with Western culture, the very hierarchical kind of dominator mindset. They're more accepting communities, but also they tended to have much more animistic practices in a lot of their religious contexts. Even where those practices have overlapped with bigger world religions like Islam or Christianity. And I think that's really interesting. Or Buddhism for that matter. the Tibetan Buddhist tradition has a lot of shamanistic sort of things built into it, and that's true in Mongolia as well. There's a lot of overlap between those things, and there's a lot of overlap between animism and there's Shinto in Japan is an animistic sort of way of looking at the world. Everything has a kami, a spirit that sort of there's the spirits of a place or the spirits of a moment, those sorts of things, and you're sort of petitioning those spirits. You're interacting with them in order to get the results that you want. And so, what does this mean? I think for me anyway, when I went through my first psychosis experience, I was given this narrative by the doctors that were very much objective or objectifying in their mindset. Materialistic, I-it relationships. They would give me this idea that I was broken, that my brain was simply defective, and that I needed to take medication to correct that for the rest of my life. And that in some sense, I was a victim of my biology, because it was like my genetics, or at least my body, that it in some way failed and was literally defective, That was really disempowering. That really left me feeling like, oh, okay, so I'm just going to live on disability for the rest of my life and I'm not going to get anywhere. And that's kind of what happened for a little while, until I started remembering, because I've always been interested in shamanic practices. I've always been interested in mindfulness meditation. Martial arts also plays a role in this for me. Yoga, all those sorts of spiritual things. I've always had an interest in that. And when I went through my first psychosis experience, meditation was a part of that experience. In some ways, I was meditating the wrong way, and I was also I was using cannabis, and I was also extremely depressed at the time. And the depression and all of those factors sort of destabilized me, but I always had this interest in this stuff, and I started to delve more into the shamanic approach. And the shamanic approach is that your sensitivity, which is really where I think a lot of psychosis comes from, is that people who experience psychosis are much more sensitive. They're much more open to the world and to what's coming into them. They're open to the energy, and however you want to interpret that word energy. If you're spiritually inclined, you want to interpret it as energy. But if you're not, you can interpret that as like the emotions of other people, or the control issues of other people, the relational dynamics, the psychological archetypes, the symbolism of what's going on. I think people that go into psychosis are much more sensitive to these things, and they frequently experience trauma as well. And so these traumas can destabilize us, and they can create a psychosis type experience. And the shamanic narrative empowers you from that. It says not only is that not a weakness, it's actually a superpower. It's actually something you can use to relate to the world better. And in relating to the world, you can use it to heal yourself, and you can use it to heal other people, or to help other people heal more accurately, to help other people heal, to facilitate the healing that other people go through, and to facilitate their journey, to be a bit of a guide or a support, in that sense, to be a hollow bone through which spirit channels, in that sense, communication from spirit, from this realm of spirit, of archetypes, of psychological forces, let's say, that have the well-being of humanity in mind, and that come from this place of love. If you want to be able to tap into that and do that, that's what a shaman does. They interact with that world. They interact with the symbolic realm so that they can interpret what's going on and then resolve whatever conflicts or whatever issues are creating an imbalance and creating ill health, or a mental health crisis, or whatever it is, or conflict within the community, or between people, that sort of thing, right? And that's kind of the shamanic narrative. And so it makes sense, and at the same time, you're learning to master your emotions. You're learning to you're managing your psychological states. You learn how to interact with yourself and relate well to yourself and all your bits and pieces, all your parts, all the parts of your body, but also all the parts of your psyche. And because you can interact with those things, you can bring yourself back into balance, and you can much more readily show up in the world in a confident and positive way, so that you can be a support to other people, and that is so much more empowering than the narrative that I was given. of just being defective, you know. And I think there's a lot of merit in that. I don't know that that's an approach that's going to work for everyone, but I think that that is an alternative perspective that really bears a lot of examination in the developed world, you know, in Western culture, because we do disempower people with these things, and then we give them medications which strip away or block their ability to really feel their emotions fully. It makes it very difficult to process, you know, your trauma and your pain, and to uncover things. Like, try doing shadow work when you're on antipsychotics. You know, shadow work being getting into the muck of your psyche, getting into the dark places, and understanding where your fears and your traumas are, and trying to bring them into the light, so to speak, to see the light of day, and then get healing, because then you can see what's going on, you can see the patterns, and then you can resolve them, you know. And so to do that kind of shadow work, which is spiritual work, you kind of need to be able to access your emotions, you know, and the medications really cut you off from that. And the whole approach, you know, so the whole approach to objectifying people, and that's what it does too. You're objectified, you know. So you are a person in psychosis, or you're a schizophrenic, or you're this or that. You're a mental health patient, and then you have to be treated with drugs, and you have to be, you know, slotted into a particular place in society. That's your pigeonhole, you know. And so I see these other ways of looking at things as much more empowering and much more freeing. You know, I don't know. I kind of rambled. I've been making a bunch of videos today, and I'm kind of in a rambly mood. So I don't know how much light this shed on anything. I'm just kind of talking, you know, and hoping that something, you know, makes sense here. But I hope it contributed to the discussion that I'm trying to foster on the channel, and I hope it gave you something. And yeah, so I'm going to probably elaborate on this in other videos. But for now, I will see you next time. Take care.